The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. There is one aspect of the story of the feeding of the 5,000 that I have always found a bit odd. When we talk about it today, we always want to put the emphasis on the miraculous nature of the story. The very idea that Jesus seems to have started with just 5 loaves and a couple of fish, and then somehow multiplied them to feed so many, confounds us. It appears to violate some of the basic laws of physics, such as the law of conservation of matter. As a result, we want to focus in on the question of how he did it, and what the people who were present might have observed. But the odd thing is that the story itself, especially the original story in the Gospel of Mark that I just read, doesn't really concern itself with that. No one asks where the extra food comes from or how Jesus did it. There is no mention of food multiplying, even though that's what we like to say happened. No one even seems surprised when the food appears. They just sit and eat. Instead, the story is much more concerned with things like the extreme remoteness of the location, the suffering and struggles of the people of Galilee, and especially about how much the food costs, even though nobody pays for it. It is so concerned with the cost that the amount is carefully calculated. It is concerned with socio-economic questions, not metaphysical ones. Though we have treated it primarily like a miracle story, I'm not entirely sure that that is what it was written to be. Is there something else going on in this story that we need to pay attention to? I suspect that there is. Would it surprise you if I told you that there is an entire story behind all of it that I think you really need to hear? This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.5, 200 denarii worth of bread and fish. Around the time when Jesus was born, a man named Herod Antipas became the ruler of Galilee and Perea. He would be the only overlord that Jesus would know for his whole life. Antipas took over the territory from his father, known as Herod the Great, whose kingdom was shared out among 4 of his sons. He did not inherit his father's capital of Jerusalem, or even his major port city of Caesarea Maritima. The largest city in his territory was Sepphoris, in the hill country of Galilee, so he naturally chose to put the center of his government there. Determined to leave his mark, Antipas immediately went to work building up his capital to turn it into a world-class city. He engaged in a 20-year-long building project. This created an opportunity for Jesus' family and many others in the villages in the vicinity. Nazareth was only about a day's journey from Sepphoris. Joseph, Jesus' father, and many others like him would travel over to the big city and try to get work. Though Joseph did work in the city with wood and stone, you probably shouldn't think of him as a highly skilled carpenter or stonemason. He would have been working for those people. You should rather think of these men from the villages as day laborers. They were like the people who hang around outside the Home Depot these days, waiting for someone to drive by and hopefully hire them for the day. The going rate for 1 day of hard labor was 1 denarius. It was barely enough to live on, and that was if you managed to earn it every day. When they weren't hiring, or when you were so sick or exhausted that you couldn't work, you were out of luck. Perhaps that is why Joseph started to take his young son, Jesus, to the work sites, even when he was still quite young. But the gig work in the city, as unreliable as it was, suddenly dried up when Jesus was somewhere in his teens. The reason was simply this: Herod Antipas gave up on Sepphoris. He decided that the city would never be a capital worthy of the kind of ruler he aspired to be. It was off in the hill country and too far from the beaten track. If he was going to build up his kingdom to be as great as his father's had been, he needed to be where the action was, the economic action. And so, Antipas made a radical decision. He would build an entirely new capital city. It would cost him an utter fortune. And it would also mean walking away from all of the money that he had already sunk into Sepphoris. But if he did it right, vast wealth would be his. He would build his capital in the right place this time. Galilee produced two key commodities. One was grain. It grew well enough in the hills. But the truly extraordinary resource, the jewel of Galilee, was the Sea of Galilee. It was the largest freshwater lake in the entire Eastern Empire. That was why Antipas chose to build his new city at the juncture between the grain-producing hills and the body of water flowing with fish. His new city would be called Tiberias, because it never hurt to curry favor with Emperor Tiberius Caesar, and he would build it on the west coast of the lake, just by the major trade road used to ship goods out of Galilee. He would also explicitly claim more than just the land the city was built on. He would rename the body of water nearby as Lake Tiberias by royal decree. And let me tell you that any mapmaker or news crier who continued to use the name that the body of water had been known by for centuries would not be allowed anywhere near Antipas's news conferences. But silliness about renaming bodies of water aside, the meaning of all of this was clear to everyone. Herod Antipas was making this move to lay claim to these two key commodities. He was declaring to everyone that the bread and the fish of Galilee didn't belong to the people of Galilee. They belonged to him. And by means of taxes and tolls and rentals and docking fees and whatever other fees he could think of, he would extract as much money as he could from every fish caught and every loaf baked throughout the land. He would corner the market on garum, the sauce made from fermented fish guts that was so loved by the Romans, and he would ship as much of that, together with the grain and the dried fish, as he could, out by the trade route to the lucrative markets in the West. He would make a killing. Surprisingly, at least as far as Antipas was concerned, the message that he was sending by moving his capital, the message that the bread and fish of Galilee belonged to him, was not well received. by the people. The new policies were making it harder and harder for people to get by. The pressure to increase exports created scarcity in staple foods. Prices were soaring, and people were going into debt just to feed their families. Then, when they defaulted on their loans, they were losing their family farms. Of course, this created a greater opportunity for the king's wealthy friends, who started to buy up the properties and assemble enslaved workforces to cultivate them. But the disruption also created even more food shortages, at least in the short term, that definitely cut into his anticipated profits. He began to hear stories of opposition among the peasantry. For example, there was one man from a village not far from the old capital who was gathering crowds of malcontents. He is apparently one of the construction workers who lost his job when the work on Sepphoris was abandoned. The loss seemed to have radicalized him. He was teaching people what seemed to be techniques of non-violent resistance, how to not fight back when they were attacked, but to present their cheek to be slapped again. Or he would teach them, when they were taken to court for their debts, to strip naked before the judge, to shame the person bringing suit. And then this man got even more troublesome. Reports came back that he was appearing in fishing villages all around Lake Tiberias. He was accosting the local fishers, telling them that they should leave their nets and their boats and follow him instead of producing income for the king. Apparently, he actually persuaded a number of them. There were reports of fishing boats being abandoned on the shore, even though they were full of fish that had been left to rot. Revenues took an even deeper tumble. Maybe that should have made Antipas stop and consider a few things. Was it possible that he was squeezing the fishers so hard that they were simply unable to make a living for their families anymore? Were they walking away from the trade because no matter how many fish they caught, it was only pushing them deeper into debt? No, that couldn't be it, the king decided. No, it had to be the fault of this rabble-rouser. He would have to keep an eye on him. One day, when Herod Antipas was just settling in for his evening meal, one of his officers interrupted him with disturbing news. "My lord," he cried, "we have just heard word of a mass gathering out in the wilderness, on the far side of the Sea of on the far side of Lake Tiberias. Apparently there were thousands of people there, and all of them ate all of the bread and the fish that they wanted." The king turned angrily to his chief accountant. "How much would it cost to feed that many people bread and fish?" he wanted to know. The accountant was used to these kinds of questions from the revenue-obsessed king, so he didn't hesitate to throw out some numbers. "Well, my lord, if there were, say, 5,000 of them, it would probably cost about 200 denarii. 200 denarii? 200 denarii? The king raged. Are you telling me that somebody distributed 200 denarii worth of food to my people, and I didn't even get a cut of the profits? Who did this? Tell me who did this. The officer hesitated, knowing that the answer would not be well received. Well, my lord, they say that this wilderness feast was staged by the same man that you had ordered us to keep an eye on, the man from Nazareth. Antipas didn't really say anything in response to that. He simply let out a huge cry of rage. The king eventually settled down enough to order his enforcers to go out and find this troublemaker. He wanted him brought in and punished at once. But this was something that was easier said than done. The man had no fixed address and was constantly wandering from one place to the next. Even worse, of course, was the fact that these wilderness feasts were taking place in the wilderness, which turned out to be really big. Sometime after the initial reports of the feast for some 5,000 people, the searchers caught word of another gathering of 4,000 or so in the region of the Galileans. They headed there immediately, but by the time they arrived, the people had long been dispersed. They looked out over a field of bread crusts and rotting fish bones and knew that they were in deep trouble. No matter what excuses they came up with, they felt sure that Antipas would not accept them. As they walked away from the site, heading out on another wild goose chase, following up on rumors of the man's movements, one of them could not help but ask a question. Hey, don't you guys think that maybe we are concentrating on the wrong end of this problem? We're trying to cut this guy off at the distribution end of things, trying to stop him from giving the bread and fish of Galilee to the people of Galilee. But have we asked where he's getting this food from without buying it from the king's markets? What if, instead of concentrating on the demand side of this economic situation, we worked on the supply side? Why don't we figure out where he's getting his supply and cut him off? Some of the others pushed back at him, though. Don't you know that we've been working on the supply side of this problem for a while? That's why Antipas moved the capital to Tiberias to control the supply chain. But whatever we do, there are always holes. People have been hiding portions of their harvest and their catches all along, and the black market has been booming. we just don't tell the king about that because we can't really stop it. Wherever this guy has been getting the bread and the fish from, we probably can't do much about that. The real problem is that he's distributing it so publicly. He's making a public demonstration of who really controls the food production in Galilee and who gets to enjoy what is produced. That's what is dangerous, and that's what will get us in trouble with the king. It's likely to spark copycats too, added another. If we don't shut this guy down soon, we could have a full-blown revolt on our hands. And you know who the boss will blame for that. Get your head in the game. If the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is just a story about a particularly amazing miracle that Jesus performed, it seems to dwell on odd details. But if you understand a bit about the historical context, those concerns make a lot of sense. The story dwells on the extreme remoteness of the place, because what they were doing was politically dangerous, and they needed to be far away from the watchful eyes of royal officials. It highlights bread and fish because these were the trade goods that Antipas had decided to monopolize. And it carefully calculates the cost of the food consumed because that was the amount of money that the king stood to lose. It doesn't really dwell on the things we want to dwell on. The question of where the sufficient supplies of food come from. They are just there, all of a sudden. I think that is intentional too. The message is that if you step out in faith and seek to provide God's people with the fruits of their own labor that have been stolen from them, God will provide. And yes, the provision is miraculous, but we are not meant to be concerned with the how, just to trust that it will happen. If I can speak personally for a moment, I have experienced that sort of miracle. I was involved for several years with an organization that served free, nutritious meals to any in the community who needed them for any reason. As often happens in such efforts, we operated on a shoestring budget. The cooks often worried that they didn't have enough to prepare a meal. But they would often speak in wonder about what they called the magic fridge. It had happened so often that what was needed most just showed up in that fridge when it was needed. And I realize, of course, that the miracle of the fridge did not require any suspension of the laws of physics. Human hands, often anonymous, had played a role. But they were hands that belonged to people who really had no way of knowing what exactly was needed and why. Nevertheless, it often perfectly fit the need. Your mileage may vary, but I don't have a problem calling that kind of provision a miracle. Miracle or not, I do think it is the perfect illustration of the principle at work in this story of Jesus. when you choose to give the food of the land to the people of the land, the problem will not be the supply. The problem will come from the fact that you are challenging the ones who have been controlling the supplies, the ones who are set on using all the wealth of the land only to enrich themselves. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next regular episode in 2 weeks' time. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod. The mood music for this episode was Romeo's Herb by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and filmmusic.io, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.